The summer of 1885 blazed across Montana Territory like a forge fire, turning the endless grasslands of Copper Valley into a shimmering sea of gold and amber. But beneath the breathtaking beauty of the Big Sky country lay tensions as hot and dangerous as the August sun beating down on the sprawling cattle ranches that stretched beyond the horizon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In this vast wilderness where fortunes were made and lost with the turn of a season, where a man's worth was measured by the thousands of head bearing his brand, Elena Martinez was about to discover that sometimes the most powerful forces in the territory would come begging at the door of a woman they had spent years trying to ignore. The morning that would change everything began like any other at Elena's modest homestead on the eastern edge of Copper Valley. She was in her makeshift veterinary clinic, a converted barn that served as both stable and surgical facility, carefully cleaning a deep gash on the leg of a sorrel mare that belonged to the Widow Thompson. The wound was infected, the kind of injury that most people in the territory would consider a death sentence for a horse. But Elena had seen worse and saved animals that others had given up on. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she applied a poultice made from herbs her grandmother had taught her to use, combined with techniques she had learned from studying every veterinary manual she could get her hands on. The mare stood quietly, somehow sensing that the small woman treating her injury knew what she was doing. Elena had always had a way with animals, a gift that had manifested itself when she was barely old enough to walk. Horses, cattle, even the wildest mustangs seemed to calm in her presence, as if they recognized something in her that spoke their language. The sound of thundering hooves approaching at breakneck speed shattered the peaceful morning routine. Elena looked up from her work to see a sight that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. Racing toward her small homestead was a group of riders led by none other than William Henderson himself, the undisputed cattle king of Copper Valley, whose Iron Creek ranch sprawled across more than 50,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Montana Territory. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking the commanding figure of Will Henderson. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat his black stallion with the easy confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem that money or influence couldn't solve. His expensive clothes and silver-trimmed saddle marked him as clearly as any brand marked his cattle. This was a man who owned more land than some eastern states, who employed over 200 ranch hands, and whose word was law throughout most of Copper Valley. What made the sight so shocking was not just his presence at Elena's humble homestead, but the obvious desperation that drove him. Will Henderson was not a man who made social calls, especially not to the daughter of Mexican immigrants who lived on 40 acres of what he probably considered worthless scrubland. The two worlds they inhabited might as well have been separated by an ocean rather than the few miles of prairie that lay between the Iron Creek ranch headquarters and Elena's small spread. As the riders drew closer, Elena could see that they were carrying someone across one of the saddles. Her heart began to race as her medical instincts kicked in, recognizing the unmistakable signs of a serious emergency. The group pulled up in front of her clinic in a cloud of dust and jangling spurs, and she got her first clear look at what had driven the most powerful man in the territory to seek her help. Lying unconscious across the saddle of Will's own horse was a boy of perhaps 12 years, his face pale and drawn with pain even in unconsciousness. Blood had soaked through makeshift bandages wrapped around his leg, and Elena could see immediately that this was no ordinary riding accident. The child's breathing was shallow and labored. His skin had the clammy pallor that spoke of serious blood loss, and the way his leg hung at an unnatural angle suggested multiple fractures and possibly worse. "Miss Martinez," Will Henderson's voice was hoarse with exhaustion and fear, stripped of the commanding tone that usually characterized his speech. "This is my son, Tommy. He's hurt bad, Real bad. Dr. Pearson Town says there's nothing he can do, that the boy's leg is too damaged to save. Says we should prepare for the worst. Elena moved quickly to help them carry the unconscious child into her clinic, her mind already racing through the possibilities and challenges that lay ahead. As they laid Tommy Henderson on her examining table, she could see why the town doctor had given up hope. The boy's left leg was a mess of compound fractures and torn tissue, the kind of injury that would challenge even the most skilled surgeon in the best-equipped hospital in San Francisco or Denver. "What happened?" she asked as she began her preliminary examination, her hands gentle but thorough as she assessed the extent of the damage. "Stampede," Will replied, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Tommy was helping move cattle near Willow Creek when something spooked the herd. His horse stumbled in a prairie dog hole and went down hard. The boy got caught under the horse, and then the cattle. His voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Elena nodded grimly. She had seen stampede injuries before, and they were almost always devastating. The combined weight of a falling horse and the trampling hooves of panicked cattle could crush bones and tear flesh in ways that taxed the limits of any healer's skill. That Tommy Henderson was still alive at all was something of a miracle, but staying alive and recovering enough to walk again were two very different things. Dr. Pierce examined him for 3 hours, continued Buck Thompson, Will's grizzled ranch foreman who had helped carry the boy inside. Said the bones were too shattered to set properly, that infection would likely set in within days. Recommended. He glanced at Will, clearly reluctant to continue. He recommended amputation, Will finished, the words coming out like a physical blow. Said it was the only way to save Tommy's life, but even then, he wasn't sure the boy would survive the surgery. Elena continued her examination in silence, her experienced hands mapping the extent of the injuries while her mind calculated possibilities. The leg was indeed severely damaged, but she had seen worse cases recover completely with the right treatment and enough time. The key was stopping the bleeding, preventing infection, and finding a way to stabilize the multiple fractures so that the bone could heal properly. "Miss Martinez," Will's voice was barely above a whisper, and when she looked up, she saw something in his eyes that she had never expected to see from the proud cattle king. Desperation, yes, but something deeper than that. This was a man who was discovering that all his wealth and power meant nothing when faced with the possibility of losing his only child. "I know we haven't exactly been neighbors," he continued, and Elena nearly smiled at the understatement. Will Henderson and his fellow cattle barons had spent years trying to force small ranchers like Elena's family off their land, using everything from economic pressure to legal manipulation to achieve their goals. The Mexican-American families who had settled in Copper Valley before the big ranchers arrived had been systematically marginalized and displaced, their traditional grazing rights ignored in favor of the massive cattle operations that generated more tax revenue for the territorial government. "I know my people and your people haven't seen eye to eye on much of anything," Will admitted. "But Tommy is all I've got left in this world. His mother died when he was born, and he's been the center of my universe ever since. I've heard things about your work with animals, seen horses walking that shouldn't have been able to walk, cattle recovering from injuries that should have killed them. People say you've got a gift, that you can do things that trained doctors can't do." Elena looked down at the unconscious boy, her heart aching for the pain he must be experiencing even in his current state. Tommy Henderson was just a child, innocent of the conflicts and prejudices that divided the adult world around him. He deserved every chance to recover and live a normal life, regardless of who his father was or what role the Henderson family had played in the struggles of Elena's community. "I can try," she said finally, "but I won't lie to you about what we're facing. The injuries are severe, and the infection risk is very real. Even if I can save the leg, there's no guarantee that he'll ever walk normally again. And the treatment will be long and difficult, requiring constant care and monitoring for weeks, maybe months. Whatever it takes, Will replied immediately. Money is no object. I'll pay any amount you ask, bring in any supplies you need from Denver or San Francisco. Just please, try to save my boy. Elena began preparing for what she knew would be the most challenging medical case of her career. The makeshift operating area in her barn clinic was far from ideal, but she had successfully performed complex procedures here before. Her instruments were clean and sharp, her knowledge of anatomy was comprehensive, and her experience with traumatic injuries was extensive, even if most of that experience had been gained treating animals rather than humans. As she worked to stabilize Tommy's condition and prepare for surgery, Elena became aware of a growing crowd gathering outside her clinic. Word had spread with the lightning speed that characterized frontier communities that Will Henderson's son had been brought to the Mexican veterinarian for treatment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Some of the observers were genuinely concerned neighbors hoping for good news, but others had come out of curiosity or skepticism about Elena's ability to handle such a serious case. Among the crowd, Elena noticed several familiar faces that filled her with concern. Judge Samuel Morrison had arrived, ostensibly to offer support to his friend Will Henderson, but Elena suspected his presence had more to do with protecting his own interests. The judge had been instrumental in many of the legal maneuvers that had transferred land from small Mexican-American ranchers to the big cattle operations, and he would not want any complications that might upset the established order in Copper Valley. Dr. Franklin Pierce was also present, his expression a mixture of professional curiosity and barely concealed disdain. The town's official physician had never hidden his opinion that Elena's veterinary work was somehow inappropriate for a woman, and he certainly didn't believe that someone without formal medical training should be attempting to treat human patients, especially not the son of the territory's most important citizen. "Henderson, you can't be serious about this," Dr. Pierce said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This woman is a horse doctor, not a surgeon. You're risking your son's life on folk remedies and animal medicine. Bring the boy back to my clinic, and I'll perform the amputation immediately. It's his only real chance." Will Henderson's jaw tightened, and for a moment Elena thought he might actually change his mind. The social pressure was intense, and she could see the conflict playing out across his weathered features. Everything in his background and experience told him to trust the established medical authority, to follow the advice of the educated white doctor rather than the Mexican woman who worked with livestock. But then he looked down at his son's pale face, and something hardened in his expression. "Dr. Pierce, you've already told me you can't save Tommy's leg. Miss Martinez says she can. Try. As far as I'm concerned, that makes her the best doctor in Montana Territory right now." The declaration sent a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd. No one had ever heard Will Henderson openly defy the established social order in such a dramatic way. By choosing Elena's unconventional treatment over Dr. Pierce's professional recommendation, he was making a statement that went far beyond medical preferences. He was saying that results mattered more than credentials, that desperate situations called for open minds, rather than rigid adherence to social hierarchies. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. She was not just treating an injured child now. She was representing her entire community's capability and worth in the eyes of people who had always dismissed them as inferior. Success would open doors and change attitudes that had seemed permanently closed. Failure would reinforce every prejudice and stereotype that had been used to justify the marginalization of Mexican-American families in Copper Valley. "I'll need complete privacy while I work," she told Will firmly. "No observers, no interruptions. This surgery will take several hours, and I need to be able to concentrate completely." "You'll have whatever you need," Will replied. "Buck, clear everyone out except family. Post guards if you have to, but nobody disturbs Miss Martinez while she's working." As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, Elena found herself alone with the most powerful man in the territory and his critically injured son. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. Less than 24 hours ago, Will Henderson would have crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Now he was literally placing his most precious possession in her hands, trusting her with the one thing in his life that money couldn't replace. The surgery itself was a grueling test of everything Elena had learned about anatomy, wound repair, and bone setting. Working by lamplight in her converted barn, she carefully cleaned and debrided the damaged tissue, removed bone fragments, and began the delicate process of realigning the fractured bones. Tommy remained unconscious throughout the procedure, which was a blessing given the primitive pain management options available to her. Hour after hour, Elena worked with painstaking precision, using techniques she had adapted from her veterinary practice and knowledge, gleaned from every medical text she had been able to acquire. Will Henderson sat in silence nearby, his weathered hands clasped tightly together, watching every move she made with the intensity of a man whose entire world hung in the balance. As dawn broke over Copper Valley, Elena finally completed the most critical phase of the surgery. Tommy's leg was splinted and bandaged, the bleeding had stopped, and his vital signs had stabilized. The boy was still unconscious, but his breathing was deeper and more regular, suggesting that the immediate crisis had passed. "Is he going to be all right?" Will asked, his voice hoarse from hours of silent vigil. "The next 48 hours will tell us," Elena replied honestly. "I've done everything I can for now, but infection is still a major risk. He'll need constant monitoring and care for weeks. The bones will take months to heal completely, and he'll need extensive rehabilitation to regain full use of the leg." Will nodded, understanding the full implications of what she was telling him. This was not going to be a quick recovery that would allow him to return to his normal life and routines. His son would require ongoing medical care that only Elena could provide, which meant establishing a relationship that went far beyond this. Single emergency treatment. "Miss Martinez," he said slowly, "I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll hear me out before you answer." Elena looked up from checking Tommy's pulse, surprised by the formal tone that had crept into Will's voice. She had expected requests for specific treatments or questions about the recovery process, not whatever was coming now. "My cattle bear my brand," Will continued, his words measured and deliberate, "but I want to bear your name. Elena, I'm asking you to marry me." The proposal hung in the air between them like a thunderclap, so unexpected and stunning that Elena was momentarily speechless. She stared at Will Henderson, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke or manipulation. But what she saw there was deadly serious. "You can't be serious," she finally managed to say. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," Will replied. "I know how this sounds. I know the timing is terrible, and I know we barely know each other. But I've spent this entire night watching you work, seeing the skill and dedication you bring to healing, and I've realized something important. You're exactly the kind of person I want in Tommy's life permanently. More than that, you're the kind of person I want in my life permanently." Elena felt her world tilting on its axis. The most powerful man in Montana Territory, a man who could have his pick of any eligible woman from San Francisco to St. Louis, was proposing marriage to a Mexican-American veterinarian who lived in a converted barn and struggled to make ends meet on 40 acres of marginal grazing land. The implications were staggering, and not just for Elena personally. A marriage between Will Henderson and Elena Martinez would shatter every social convention in Copper Valley, create political earthquakes that would be felt throughout the territorial government, and establish precedents that could transform the relationships between the Anglo cattle barons and the Mexican-American community. But as Elena looked down at Tommy's peaceful face, she realized that Will's proposal was about much more than social conventions or political implications. This was about a father's desperate love for his son, about a man who had discovered that his carefully constructed world of wealth and power meant nothing when faced with the possibility of losing the person he loved most. The choice Elena faced would determine not just her own future, but the future of two very different communities that had been locked in conflict for years. Her answer would send ripples through Copper Valley that could either heal old wounds or tear them open wider than ever before. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Montana prairie, casting long shadows across the grasslands where fortunes were made and lost with each changing season, Elena Martinez stood at the crossroads of her life, holding the power to transform not just her own destiny, but the destiny of everyone around her. The silence that followed Will Henderson's marriage proposal stretched between them like a vast canyon, filled with the weight of implications that neither of them had fully grasped when the words first left his lips. Elena felt as though the earth beneath her feet had shifted, transforming the familiar landscape of her small clinic into foreign territory where nothing was quite what it seemed. The man who had spent years as a distant figure of power and privilege was now standing before her, vulnerable and exposed, asking her to share not just his name, but his entire complicated world. "You don't understand what you're asking," Elena said finally, her voice barely above a whisper as she continued to monitor Tommy's breathing. "A marriage between us wouldn't just be about two people choosing to build a life together. It would be about joining two communities that have been at odds for years, about bridging a divide that most people believe can't be crossed." Will stepped closer to the makeshift operating table where his son lay recovering, his weathered hands gently brushing a strand of dark hair from Tommy's forehead. "Maybe that's exactly what this territory needs," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time for someone to show that these divisions don't have to be permanent, that people can choose cooperation over conflict if they're brave enough to try." Elena studied Will's face carefully, searching for any sign of the calculated manipulation that she had learned to expect from powerful men when they wanted something from people like her. What she saw instead was a weariness that went beyond the physical exhaustion of the long night's vigil. This was a man who had been carrying burdens that money and influence couldn't lighten, who had discovered that success measured in cattle and acres meant nothing when faced with the possibility of losing his child. "You don't know me," Elena pointed out, though her tone was gentler now. "We've lived in the same valley for years, but we've moved in completely different circles. You know my reputation as a healer, but you don't know anything about who I am as a person, what I believe, what I want from life." Will nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. "You're right, and under normal circumstances, that would make my proposal completely inappropriate. But these aren't normal circumstances, Elena. What I've seen tonight, watching you work to save Tommy's life, tells me more about your character than years of social conversations could reveal. I've seen your skill, your dedication, your courage in taking on a case that a trained doctor had given up on. More than that, I've seen your compassion for a child you barely knew, your willingness to risk your own reputation to help someone who needed your particular gifts." Elena moved to check the splints on Tommy's leg, using the activity to give herself time to process the enormity of what Will was suggesting. A marriage between them would indeed send shockwaves through Copper Valley's established social order, challenging assumptions and prejudices that had seemed as permanent as the mountains surrounding their valley. The Mexican-American families who had been systematically marginalized would suddenly have a voice at the highest levels of territorial society, while the Anglo cattle barons would have to accept one of their own choosing to cross racial and cultural lines in the most intimate way possible. "Think about what this would mean for Tommy," Will continued, his voice taking on a note of urgency. "His recovery is going to be long and difficult, requiring specialized care that only you can provide. If you marry me, you'd be able to monitor his progress constantly, adjust his treatment as needed, ensure that he gets the best possible chance at a full recovery. But more than that, you'd be giving him something he's never had before, a mother figure who could help him navigate a world that's more complicated than he realizes. The mention of Tommy's motherless state touched something deep in Elena's heart. She had grown up with the constant love and guidance of her own mother, Maria Santos, and she understood the void that existed in a child's life when that feminine influence was missing. Tommy Henderson might have every material advantage that money could provide, but he was growing up in a world of rough ranch hands and business associates, lacking the gentle guidance that only a woman could offer. You're using your son's condition to pressure me into a decision that should be based on genuine feeling, Elena said, though her tone carried more sadness than anger. That's not fair to any of us, especially not to Tommy himself. Will's face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. You're right, and I apologize. I'm not handling this well, but I'm not thinking clearly right now. The truth is, Elena, watching you work tonight has opened my eyes to possibilities I never considered before. You have abilities and knowledge that could benefit not just my family, but this entire community. The way you've adapted veterinary techniques to human medicine, the herbal remedies you've developed, the way you seem to understand the connection between healing the body and healing the spirit, all of it represents an approach to medicine that we desperately need in this territory. Elena found herself genuinely curious about Will's perspective, despite her wariness about his motives. What do you mean? Dr. Pierce is a competent physician by conventional standards, Will explained, but he's limited by rigid thinking and unwillingness to consider approaches that don't fit his formal training. He's lost patients that might have been saved with more creative treatment methods. The territory needs healers who can think beyond established boundaries, who can adapt and improvise when standard procedures aren't sufficient. The conversation was interrupted by a soft moan from Tommy, who was beginning to show signs of returning consciousness. Elena immediately moved to his side, checking his pupils and pulse while speaking to him in the gentle, reassuring tone she used with all her patients. "Tommy, you're safe," she said softly. "You've been hurt, but you're going to be all right. Just rest and let your body heal." The boy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, but gradually centering on Elena's face. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice weak but clear. "I'm Elena Martinez," she replied. "I'm a doctor, and I've been taking care of your leg." Tommy tried to sit up, but Elena gently pressed him back down onto the examining table. "My leg hurts," he said, a note of fear creeping into his voice as he began to remember the accident. "I know it does, and it's going to hurt for a while." "As it heals," Elena told him honestly. "But the important thing is that you're going to keep your leg, and with time and hard work, you'll be able to walk and ride again." Will moved closer to his son, relief evident on his face as he saw Tommy's alert, responsive condition. "Hey there, cowboy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave your old man quite a scare. Dad?" Tommy's eyes moved between his father and Elena, confusion evident on his young face. "What happened? Where are we?" "You were helping with the cattle drive when your horse stumbled," Will explained gently. "You got hurt pretty bad, and Dr. Pearson Town said there wasn't much he could do. So I brought you to Miss Martinez here, and she's worked a miracle to save your leg." Tommy looked up at Elena with new interest and respect. "You're a real doctor?" "I'm a veterinarian," Elena explained. "I usually care for animals, but healing works the same whether it's a horse or a human." "That's so cool," Tommy said, his natural resilience already shining through despite his injuries. "I've never met a lady doctor before. My dad says women aren't smart enough to be doctors, but you must be really smart, especially since you fixed my leg when the other doctor couldn't." Will flushed with embarrassment at his son's innocent admission, but Elena only smiled at Tommy's blunt honesty. Being smart has nothing to do with being a man or woman, Tommy, she told him gently. It's about working hard, practicing your skills, and not giving up when things get tough. Over the next several days, as Tommy steadily recovered, Elena found herself slipping into a rhythm that blurred the lines between her role as a healer and something more personal. Will stayed at her homestead to remain close to his son during this crucial period, sleeping in her modest guest room and assisting with Tommy's care. By Copper Valley's standards, the arrangement was highly improper, and Elena was fully aware of the rumors likely spreading. An unmarried Mexican-American woman living under the same roof as the territory's most eligible Anglo bachelor was enough to spark scandal and potentially ruin reputations. Yet the more time she spent with Will, the more she saw parts of him she hadn't expected. Removed from the responsibilities of managing his vast ranch and freed from societal expectations, he was simply a devoted father, gentle with Tommy's fears, endlessly patient, and committed to helping his son heal. Even more surprising, Will showed genuine curiosity about Elena's work. He asked insightful questions about her herbal treatments, her strategies for promoting bone healing, and her belief in treating the whole patient, not just the injury. His interest wasn't superficial or patronizing. He truly respected her knowledge. Where did you learn to mix these healing methods? He asked one evening, watching her prepare a tea to reduce inflammation in Tommy's leg. My grandmother taught me, Elena replied, carefully measuring willow bark, echinacea, and other herbs. She was a curandera, traditional healer who knew how to use plants most people think are just weeds. But I've also studied every veterinary and medical book I could find, combining science with tradition. That's revolutionary, Will said thoughtfully. Most people act like you have to choose either the old ways or the new, never both. Elena looked up, impressed by his observation. Exactly. Healing isn't about picking sides. It's about using what works, whether that's a centuries-old remedy or modern medicine. The real skill lies in knowing which approach fits the situation. As the days passed, their conversations deepened. They moved beyond medicine to talk about life in Copper Valley, the challenges different communities faced, and the potential for a more cooperative, inclusive future. Elena realized that Will's views on the territory's politics were more thoughtful than she'd assumed. He wasn't just a rich rancher chasing profit. He was someone genuinely worried about sustainability and fairness. The system's broken, Will admitted one evening as Tommy slept nearby. Big ranchers focus only on short-term gains. They're overgrazing, burning through resources that should last generations. Meanwhile, small farmers and traditional ranchers are getting pushed out along with their deep knowledge of the land. Everyone's fighting over scraps instead of figuring out how to make things better for everyone. Elena began to question her own assumptions about him. The man she'd once seen as a symbol of privilege and greed turned out to be far more complex. He had inherited power and wealth early in life, and now was searching for a way to use that influence to create positive change. What would you do if you had the chance to fix the system? She asked, genuinely intrigued by his vision. Will was silent for a moment, staring out at the vast grasslands stretching toward the horizon. I'd bring more voices to the table, he said finally. Mexican-American families were here long before the big ranches. They know the land, the weather, the grazing cycles, the water sources. That kind of knowledge is priceless. If we actually listened, we could manage this land more wisely for everyone. But instead of learning from that expertise, we've been trying to eliminate it. The admission was stunning in its implications. Elena had never heard any of the prominent Anglo ranchers acknowledge that the displaced Mexican-American families possessed valuable knowledge, much less suggest that their expertise should be incorporated into territorial planning. Will's willingness to question the fundamental assumptions that had justified years of discriminatory policies suggested a capacity for growth and change that Elena hadn't believed possible. As Tommy's recovery progressed and he became strong enough to sit up and take more interest in his surroundings, Elena began to see another dimension of Will's character through his interactions with his son. He was teaching Tommy about ranch management and business principles, but he was also emphasizing values that surprised Elena with their depth and thoughtfulness. "Remember, son," Will said during one of their conversations about the cattle business, "the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land. Our job is to take care of it so that it can take care of future generations. That means thinking beyond what's profitable this year to what's sustainable for the next 50 years. Tommy listened with the serious attention that children give to lessons they sense are important, asking questions that showed he was genuinely trying to understand the complexities of responsible land stewardship. Elena found herself moved by the obvious love and respect between father and son, and by Will's efforts to raise Tommy with a broader perspective than the one that had shaped his own upbringing. The growing intimacy of their shared domestic routine was creating emotional complications that Elena hadn't anticipated. Despite her initial skepticism about Will's motives, she was finding herself genuinely attracted to the man she was discovering beneath the public persona of the cattle king. His intelligence, his devotion to his son, his willingness to question his own assumptions and grow beyond the limitations of his background. All of these qualities drew her to him in ways that had nothing to do with his wealth or social position. But Elena was also acutely aware of the practical and political implications of any romantic relationship between them. The temporary arrangement that had allowed Will to stay at her homestead during Tommy's recovery was already pushing the boundaries of social acceptability. Any suggestion that their relationship was becoming personal rather than purely professional would create a scandal that could have far-reaching consequences for both of their communities. The crisis that would force Elena to confront these complications directly came from an unexpected source. Judge Samuel Morrison arrived at Elena's homestead one afternoon with Deputy Jake Sullivan in tow, ostensibly to check on Tommy's recovery, but clearly motivated by other concerns. The judge's expression was stern and disapproving as he took in the domestic scene of Will helping Elena prepare medicines while Tommy watched from his bed nearby. "Henderson," Judge Morrison said without preamble, "people are talking, and the talk isn't good. You've been living here for over a week now, staying in the home of an unmarried woman without any proper chaperone or social oversight. It's creating exactly the kind of scandal that we can't afford in a territory that's trying to establish itself as civilized and respectable." Will's jaw tightened at the judge's accusatory tone, but he kept his voice level as he replied, "My son was critically injured, and Miss Martinez is providing the medical care he needs. I'm staying close to monitor his recovery, nothing more. The appearance is what matters," Judge Morrison continued, "and the appearance is that you're living in sin with a Mexican woman, legitimizing exactly the kind of racial mixing that undermines the social order we've worked to establish in Copper Valley." Elena felt anger rising in her chest at the judge's casual racism, but she forced herself to remain calm and professional. "Judge Morrison, I'm providing medical treatment to a patient who requires constant monitoring. Mr. Henderson's presence here is purely for his son's welfare, and any suggestion otherwise is both inappropriate and inaccurate." "Miss Martinez," the judge replied with barely concealed condescension, "I'm sure your intentions are honorable, but you must understand that as a woman in your position, you have certain responsibilities to maintain proper appearances. This situation has gone beyond what society can accept, regardless of the medical necessities involved." Deputy Sullivan, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke up with obvious discomfort. "Judge, maybe we should focus on the boy's recovery rather than worrying about gossip. Miss Martinez has done remarkable work, and Tommy Henderson is alive because of her skill." Judge Morrison's eyes narrowed at the deputy's mild contradiction of his authority. "Deputy Sullivan, your job is to enforce the law and maintain order, not to provide commentary on medical matters. The law in question here involves public morality and the standards of behavior that civilized society requires. The confrontation was escalating rapidly toward a crisis that could force Elena to choose between continuing to provide the care that Tommy needed and protecting herself from legal and social consequences. The judge clearly had the power to create serious problems for her if he decided that her living arrangement with Will was inappropriate, regardless of the medical justification for the situation. Will stepped forward, his posture and expression making it clear that he was prepared to defend Elena against any threats or intimidation. Judge Morrison, Miss Martinez has saved my son's life and is providing ongoing care that no one else in this territory can provide. Any interference with her medical practice would be not only inappropriate, but potentially criminal. Mr. Henderson, Judge Morrison replied with cold formality, your gratitude for Miss Martinez's services is understandable, but it doesn't override the legal and social standards that govern behavior in this community. I'm prepared to be reasonable about this situation, but only if appropriate steps are taken to address the impropriety. Elena realized that they had reached the moment of truth that Will's marriage proposal had anticipated. The judge was essentially demanding that their living arrangement be legitimized through marriage or terminated immediately, regardless of the impact on Tommy's recovery. The personal choice that had seemed impossibly complicated was being forced by external pressures that left little room for gradual consideration or careful deliberation. The weight of decision pressed down on Elena as she looked from Will's determined face to Tommy's worried expression to the judge's stern disapproval. Whatever choice she made now would determine not just her own future, but the future of the fragile cooperation that had begun to develop between their two communities. The bridge that had started to form through shared commitment to Tommy's welfare was about to be tested by forces that had no interest in healing or understanding, only in maintaining the divisions that preserved existing power structures. Elena Martinez stood at the crossroads of her life, surrounded by men who represented different visions of what Copper Valley could become, knowing that her next words would echo through the territory for years to come. The tension in Elena's small clinic crackled like electricity before a Montana thunderstorm as she faced the assembled men who had gathered to determine her fate. Judge Morrison's ultimatum hung in the air between them, demanding an immediate resolution to what he considered an intolerable breach of social convention. Elena could feel the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders, knowing that whatever decision she made in the next few minutes would ripple through Copper Valley for generations to come. Judge Morrison, Elena said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart, I understand your concerns about propriety, but my primary obligation is to my patient. Tommy Henderson requires specialized care that cannot be provided at a distance. Any decision about living arrangements must take his medical needs into consideration first. The judge's face darkened at what he perceived as defiance from someone he considered to be in no position to negotiate. Miss Martinez, you seem to be under the impression that you have choices in this matter. Let me clarify the situation for you. As a magistrate in this territory, I have the authority to determine what constitutes appropriate behavior within my jurisdiction. The current arrangement is unacceptable, and it will be terminated immediately. Will Henderson stepped forward, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the small clinic as he positioned himself between Elena and the judge. Morrison, you're overstepping your authority here. Miss Martinez is providing medical care to my son under my direction and with my full approval. Any interference with that care would constitute harassment of a medical professional in the performance of her duties. Henderson, your gratitude for this woman's services doesn't override the moral standards that govern civilized society. Judge Morrison replied, his tone growing more authoritative. I'm offering you a reasonable solution to an untenable situation. Marry the woman if you feel obligated to maintain her services, or remove your son to more appropriate accommodations where proper supervision can be maintained. Elena felt a surge of anger at being discussed as though she were merely a piece of property to be disposed of according to the convenience of powerful men. "I am standing right here," she said firmly, "and I am perfectly capable of speaking. For myself. This is my home, my medical practice, and my patient. Any decisions about how I conduct my professional affairs will be made by me, not by men who have no understanding of the medical complexities involved." Deputy Sullivan shifted uncomfortably, clearly troubled by the direction the confrontation was taking. "Judge, maybe we should consider the fact that Miss Martinez has accomplished something that our town doctor couldn't accomplish. The boy's leg is healing remarkably well, and forcing a change in his care right now could set back his recovery significantly." "Deputy Sullivan," Judge Morrison snapped, "your job is to enforce the law, not to provide medical opinions or question the decisions of your superiors. The moral and legal standards of this community are not subject to debate based on medical convenience." Elena realized that the situation was rapidly spiraling beyond any hope of reasonable compromise. Judge Morrison was clearly determined to use his authority to force a resolution that would maintain the social hierarchy he represented, regardless of the impact on Tommy's health or Elena's professional autonomy. The confrontation had become about much more than medical care or living arrangements. It had become a test of whether the established power structure in Copper Valley would tolerate any challenge to its control over the lives of people like Elena. Tommy, who had been listening to the adult conversation with growing alarm, suddenly spoke up from his bed with the clear voice of a child who didn't understand why the adults around him were creating such unnecessary complications. "Why can't Miss Elena just marry my dad if that's what it takes for her to keep taking care of me? She's been nicer to me than anyone except Dad, and she's really smart. And she saved my leg when the other doctor said it couldn't be saved." The innocent logic of Tommy's suggestion cut through the tension in the room like a knife through butter, highlighting the artificial nature of the barriers that were preventing a simple solution to their dilemma. Elena found herself looking at the boy with new appreciation for his ability to see past the social complexities that were paralyzing the adults around him. Will's expression softened as he looked at his son, and Elena could see the internal struggle playing out across his weathered features. "Tommy, marriage is something that should happen because two people love each other and want to build a life together, not because of legal or social pressure. But you do like Miss Elena, don't you, Dad?" Tommy persisted with the relentless honesty of childhood. "I can tell you think she's special, and she's been taking really good care of both of us. And she's teaching me things about healing that I never knew before." Elena felt her heart constrict at the boy's words, recognizing the truth in his observation about the growing connection between herself and Will. Despite the circumstances that had brought them together, despite the complications and pressures surrounding their situation, she had developed genuine feelings for the man who had surprised her with his depth, intelligence, and capacity for growth beyond the limitations of his background. Judge Morrison's patience was clearly reaching its limit as he watched the family dynamic playing out before him. "This touching domestic scene doesn't change the fundamental legal and moral issues at stake here, Mr. Henderson. I'm prepared to give you exactly 1 hour to make a decision. Either formalize this arrangement through immediate marriage or remove your son to more appropriate accommodations. I will not tolerate any further delay in resolving this scandal." The ultimatum galvanized Elena into action as she realized that her silence was being interpreted as passive acceptance of the judge's authority to dictate the terms of her life. "Judge Morrison, you have no legal standing to force me into marriage or to interfere with my medical practice. I am a free woman conducting a legitimate business on my own property, and your demands constitute harassment and intimidation." "Miss Martinez," the judge replied with cold formality, "you are a woman of questionable background living in violation of community standards. I have both the legal authority and the moral obligation to ensure that such situations are corrected before they undermine the social fabric of our territory. Deputy Sullivan's discomfort was becoming increasingly evident as he witnessed the judge's heavy-handed exercise of power. "Judge, I'm not sure we have the legal grounds to force anyone into marriage or to interfere with legitimate medical practice. Maybe we should consult with the territorial attorney before taking any drastic action." "Deputy Sullivan." Judge Morrison's voice carried a warning that was unmistakable. "Your continued questioning of my authority is becoming insubordinate. I suggest you remember where your loyalty should lie in this matter." Elena recognized that Deputy Sullivan was struggling with his own crisis of conscience, torn between his duty to follow orders and his growing conviction that those orders were unjust. The young lawman's questioning of the judge's authority represented exactly the kind of crack in the established power structure that could lead to broader change, if enough people found the courage to stand up for what was right rather than what was expedient. Will Henderson's jaw tightened as he watched the judge's increasingly aggressive behavior toward both Elena and Deputy Sullivan. "Morrison, you're way out of line here. Elena is providing essential medical care to my son, and your interference is putting his recovery at risk. If you want to discuss social conventions, we can do that after Tommy is fully healed." "Henderson, your sentiment is admirable but misguided," Judge Morrison replied. "The standards of this community cannot be suspended indefinitely for medical convenience. A decision must be made today, and it will be made according to the law and moral principles that govern civilized society." Elena felt the walls closing in around her as she realized that the judge was determined to force a crisis that would either legitimize her relationship with Will through marriage or destroy the progress they had made in Tommy's treatment and in building understanding between their communities. The choice she faced was no longer simply about her personal feelings or professional obligations. It had become a test of whether justice and compassion could prevail over prejudice and institutional power. As she looked around the room at the faces of the men whose decisions would shape her future, Elena noticed something that gave her a glimmer of hope. Deputy Sullivan's expression had shifted from uncomfortable compliance to quiet determination, suggesting that his questioning of the judge's authority was developing into something more substantial than mere doubt. Will's posture indicated that he was prepared to fight for her right to make her own choices, regardless of the social consequences. Even Tommy, despite his youth and injuries, was watching the proceedings with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more about the stakes involved than anyone had given him credit for. "Judge Morrison," Elena said, drawing herself up to her full height and meeting his stern gaze directly, "I will not be bullied or intimidated into making decisions about my personal life based on your interpretation of social propriety. If you have specific legal charges to bring against me, then bring them through proper channels. If not, then I suggest you leave my property and allow me to continue providing medical care to my patient." The direct challenge to his authority sent a flush of anger across Judge Morrison's face, and Elena could see that she had pushed him beyond the limits of his self-control. "Miss Martinez, you are making a serious mistake in defying the legal authority of this territory. I have the power to make your life very difficult if you continue on this course. And I have the power to expose corruption and abuse of authority when I see it," Elena replied, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Your threats don't intimidate me, Judge Morrison. They just prove that you're more concerned with maintaining your own power than with ensuring justice or protecting the welfare of the people you're supposed to serve." Will moved closer to Elena, his presence providing both physical and emotional support as she faced down the most powerful legal authority in Copper Valley. "Elena's right, Morrison. Your behavior here today has been completely inappropriate, and I intend to file a formal complaint with the territorial government about your abuse of authority." Judge Morrison's eyes narrowed dangerously as he realized that his attempt to resolve the situation quickly and quietly had instead created a confrontation that could have far-reaching political consequences. Mr. Henderson, you are making enemies. You cannot afford to make. My influence extends far beyond this valley, and your business interests depend on maintaining good relationships with territorial authorities. The implied threat to Will's economic interests represented exactly the kind of institutional pressure that had been used for years to maintain social divisions and prevent challenges to the established order. Elena held her breath, wondering whether Will would have the courage to risk his financial empire for the sake of principle, or whether the judge's intimidation would prove effective in breaking the fragile alliance they had built. Will's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Morrison, my business interests don't depend on corruption or abuse of power. If you want to threaten my livelihood because I refuse to allow you to intimidate a woman who saved my son's life, then you're proving exactly why this territory needs new leadership." The declaration sent a shockwave through the room, representing a complete rejection of the political alliances that had maintained stability in Copper Valley for years. Will Henderson was essentially declaring war on the institutional power structure that had enabled his own success, choosing to side with Elena and her community against the interests of his traditional allies. Deputy Sullivan seized the moment of disruption to make his own stand. "Judge Morrison, I've been listening to this conversation, and I don't think what you're doing here is legal or right. Miss Martinez has committed no crime, violated no law, and doesn't deserve to be threatened or intimidated because she saved a boy's life." The deputy's defection was the final straw that broke Judge Morrison's composure completely. "Deputy Sullivan, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Your badge and weapon will be surrendered to me before you leave this property." Elena watched in amazement as the confrontation she had tried to avoid spiraled into a complete breakdown of the local power structure. Judge Morrison's heavy-handed tactics had created exactly the kind of crisis that could lead to fundamental change in Copper Valley, but the immediate consequences for everyone involved would be severe and unpredictable. "Judge Morrison," Elena said, her voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority, "you've just demonstrated why this community needs leaders who are committed to justice rather than maintaining their own power. Your abuse of authority today will not be forgotten, and it will not go unchallenged." Will stepped forward to stand beside Elena, his decision clearly made despite the costs it would entail. "Morrison, you've shown your true colors here today. Elena Martinez is the finest person I've ever met, and I'm proud to stand with her against the kind of tyranny you represent." Tommy's voice piped up from his bed, clear and strong despite his injuries. "Miss Elena, will you marry my dad? He really likes you, and I think you like him too, and maybe together you can fix more than just broken legs." The simple proposal from the boy who had brought them together in the first place cut through all the political maneuvering and legal threats to focus on the essential human choice that lay at the heart of their dilemma. Elena looked from Tommy's hopeful face to Will's determined expression to Deputy Sullivan's quiet support, realizing that she had found something in this unlikely alliance that she had never expected to discover. "Yes, Tommy," Elena said, her voice warm with affection and conviction. "I will marry your father. Not because Judge Morrison demands it, and not because social convention requires it, but because I've discovered that your family represents everything I want to build my life around." Will's face broke into a smile that transformed his weathered features, revealing the younger man who existed beneath the responsibilities and burdens of his position. "Elena Martinez, you've just made me the luckiest man in Montana Territory." Judge Morrison's expression was thunderous as he realized that his attempt to force compliance had instead created a marriage alliance that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Copper Valley. "This isn't over," he said grimly. "You've made choices today that will have consequences you can't even imagine." "Judge Morrison," Elena replied with quiet confidence, "we've all made choices today. The question is whether those choices will lead toward justice and understanding, or toward more of the same corruption and division that has held this territory back for too long. As the judge stormed out of the clinic with obvious fury, Elena realized that she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Her marriage to Will Henderson would create ripple effects throughout Montana territory, challenging assumptions and opening possibilities that neither of their communities had dared to imagine. The confrontation that had seemed like a crisis had instead become the catalyst for transformation that could reshape the entire social landscape of Copper Valley. The woman who had started the day as an isolated healer treating a single patient had become the center of a movement that would test whether love and understanding could triumph over fear and prejudice. The bridge she was building with Will Henderson was no longer just personal. It had become a symbol of hope for everyone who believed that change was possible, if people had the courage to reach across the divides that seemed to separate them. Deputy Sullivan picked up his badge from where Judge Morrison had demanded he place it and handed it back to Elena with a smile. "Miss Martinez, I think this territory is going to need new leadership, and I'd be honored to serve under someone who has the courage to stand up for what's right." Elena accepted the badge with a sense of responsibility that went far beyond anything she had ever imagined for herself. The choices she had made in the past few minutes had not just determined her personal future. They had set in motion changes that could transform the lives of everyone in Copper Valley. The healing she had begun with Tommy's broken leg was expanding to encompass the broken relationships between entire communities, and she was discovering that her true calling might be much larger than she had ever dared to dream. 25 years after that fateful autumn night when Elena Martinez first pulled Tommy Henderson back from the edge of death, Copper Valley had transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to the divided community of 1885. The woman who had once worked alone in a converted barn clinic now stood at the podium of the Montana Territorial Medical College, the first institution of its kind to formally integrate traditional indigenous healing practices with modern scientific medicine. Elena Henderson, as she was now known throughout the West, had become one of the most respected medical authorities in the entire region. Her innovations in cross-cultural healing attracting students and patients from across the continent. The medical college itself stood as a testament to the power of cooperation and shared knowledge. Built on land donated by the Iron Creek Ranch and funded through a combination of territorial appropriations and private donations from ranchers throughout Montana, the institution represented everything that Elena and Will had worked to achieve. In their quarter-century of marriage, the faculty included not only traditionally trained physicians, but also curanderas, tribal medicine men, and other practitioners whose knowledge had been marginalized for generations. Students learned to approach healing as a comprehensive art that drew on the best elements of multiple traditions, rather than limiting themselves to a single approach. Dr. Thomas Henderson, now 37 years old and serving as the college's head of surgical medicine, embodied the synthesis of cultures that his adoptive mother and father had pioneered. Raised equally in Anglo and Mexican American traditions, fluent in Spanish and English, as well as several Native American languages, Tommy had become a bridge between worlds in ways that even Elena had never dared to imagine when she first agreed to treat his injuries. His leg, which Dr. Pierce had wanted to amputate all those years ago, had healed so completely that no trace of the original trauma remained, and Tommy now moved with the easy grace of a man completely comfortable in his own body. The techniques that Mama Elena developed for treating complex fractures have revolutionized orthopedic surgery throughout the West, Tommy told the assembled students during his weekly lecture on integrated healing methods. But the real breakthrough wasn't just medical. It was philosophical. She taught us that healing involves understanding the whole person, not just the injured part, and that the best solutions often come from combining knowledge that different cultures have developed over centuries. the student body that listened to Tommy's lecture reflected the diverse society that Copper Valley had become. Young men and women from Mexican-American, Anglo, and Native American backgrounds worked together as colleagues and friends, their relationships unmarked by the racial tensions that had once defined territorial society. Many of these students were the children and grandchildren of people who had attended Elena and Will's wedding, carrying forward the legacy of integration and cooperation that their parents had witnessed being born. Elena's own children, born over the course of her marriage to Will, had grown into remarkable adults who embodied the best qualities of both their parents' traditions. Maria Elena Henderson, named for her maternal grandmother, had followed her mother into medicine but specialized in pediatric care, developing innovative treatments for childhood diseases that combined herbal remedies with modern pharmaceuticals. Her younger brother, Carlos William Henderson, had become a leading advocate for sustainable ranching practices, traveling throughout the West to teach other cattlemen how to manage their land in harmony with natural ecosystems. The Iron Creek Ranch itself had evolved far beyond its origins as a simple cattle operation. Under the management of Carlos Martinez, Elena's brother, and later his son Roberto, the ranch had become a demonstration center for sustainable agriculture and animal husbandry. Visitors came from as far away as Europe to study the integration of traditional Mexican ranching methods with modern scientific approaches to land management. The ranch's success had proven that environmental stewardship and economic prosperity were not contradictory goals, but complementary aspects of responsible business practice. Will Henderson, now in his 60s, had transitioned from active ranch management to territorial politics, serving as Montana's representative to Congress and advocating for policies that promoted integration and cooperation rather than division and conflict. His political career had been built on the foundation of practical success that his marriage to Elena had made possible, demonstrating to voters throughout the territory that inclusive policies produced better results than exclusionary ones. The prosperity that Copper Valley has achieved over the past 25 years didn't happen by accident. Will told a gathering of territorial officials during a conference on economic development. It happened because we learned to value the contributions that all our citizens could make, regardless of their background or the color of their skin. When you include everyone in the process of building a community, you get solutions that work for everyone. The economic data supported Will's argument convincingly. Copper Valley had become one of the most prosperous regions in Montana Territory, with higher per capita income, lower crime rates, and better educational outcomes than areas that had maintained traditional social hierarchies. The integration that Elena and Will had pioneered had created a more dynamic and resilient economy that could adapt to changing circumstances and take advantage of opportunities that more rigid communities missed. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the town of Copper Valley itself, which had grown from a small frontier settlement into a thriving center of commerce and culture. The main street featured businesses owned by families from all the ethnic groups that comprised the community, their success built on the foundation of mutual respect and cooperation that Elena and Will's marriage had helped establish. The Silver Dollar Saloon, once a gathering place exclusively for Anglo cowboys and ranchers, had evolved into a community center where people from all backgrounds came together to discuss local issues and celebrate shared achievements. Father Miguel Hernandez, now elderly but still active in community affairs, had seen his small church grow into the spiritual center for a congregation that transcended traditional ethnic and cultural boundaries. When I married Elena and Will, all those years ago, he reflected during a recent sermon, I knew we were witnessing something special. But I never imagined that their love would become the foundation for transforming an entire community. They showed us that when people choose understanding over fear, cooperation over conflict, miracles become possible. The church itself had been rebuilt and expanded several times to accommodate the growing congregation, and its architecture reflected the cultural synthesis that characterized the community. Traditional Mexican design elements were combined with Anglo building techniques and Native American artistic motifs, creating a structure that belonged fully to all the traditions it represented while being limited by none of them. Education had become one of Copper Valley's greatest strengths, with schools that prepared students for success in a rapidly changing world. The curriculum that Elena had originally developed for the ranch school had been adopted throughout the territory, emphasizing practical skills alongside academic subjects and teaching students to value diverse perspectives and approaches to problem solving. Graduates of Copper Valley schools were sought after by colleges and employers throughout the West because of their reputation for adaptability, creativity, and collaborative skills. The legal system that had once been dominated by corrupt officials, like Judge Morrison, had been completely reformed, with new laws and procedures that protected the rights of all citizens, regardless of their ethnic background or economic status. Jake Sullivan, Elena's former supporter who had defected from Morrison's service, had eventually been elected sheriff and later appointed to the Territorial Supreme Court, where he continued to advocate for justice and equality under the law. The changes we've seen in Copper Valley prove that the law can be a tool for building justice rather than maintaining injustice, Sullivan observed during a recent legal conference. When Elena Henderson stood up to Judge Morrison all those years ago, she wasn't just defending her own rights. She was defending the principle that no one should be above the law and no one should be beneath its protection. The influence of Copper Valley's transformation had spread far beyond the territory's borders, inspiring similar integration efforts throughout the American West. Communities in Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and California had sent delegations to study the policies and practices that had made such remarkable change possible. Elena had become a frequent speaker at conferences and symposiums, sharing her experiences and encouraging other communities to embrace the diversity that could be their greatest strength. The medical innovations that had emerged from Elena's integrated approach to healing had also gained recognition from the broader scientific community. Medical journals published her research on combining traditional herbal remedies with modern pharmaceuticals, and universities invited her to lecture on the theoretical foundations of cross-cultural healing practices. Her work had helped legitimize traditional medicine in ways that opened new possibilities for indigenous healers throughout the Americas. Native American tribes that had been systematically excluded from territorial society had gradually been welcomed into the community that Elena and Will had helped create. The healing knowledge of tribal medicine men was now valued and preserved alongside other traditional practices, creating a comprehensive system of healthcare that could address conditions and injuries that no single tradition could handle alone. The respect that Elena had shown for indigenous knowledge had helped break down barriers that had seemed insurmountable, proving that cooperation was possible even across the deepest cultural divides. The environmental benefits of the integrated approach to land management had also become apparent over time. The sustainable ranching practices that Carlos Martinez had introduced had improved soil quality, increased biodiversity, and created more resilient ecosystems that could better withstand droughts and other natural challenges. The ranch's success had inspired changes in land use policy throughout the territory, leading to regulations that encouraged conservation and sustainability rather than short-term exploitation. As Elena approached her 60th birthday, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from a lonely veterinarian working in a converted barn to one of the most influential people in Montana Territory. The path had not always been easy, and there had been setbacks and challenges that had tested her resolve and commitment to the vision she shared with Will, but the results spoke for themselves in ways that even the most skeptical observers could not deny. The morning routine that Elena followed had changed remarkably little over the years. Despite her elevated status and expanded responsibilities, she still rose early to tend to animals in the ranch's medical facility, still mixed herbal remedies with the same care and precision that had characterized her work from the beginning, still approached each patient with the combination of scientific knowledge and intuitive understanding that had made her healing so effective. Tommy often joined her during these morning sessions, and their conversations had evolved into collaborative discussions about complex medical cases and innovative treatment approaches. The boy who had once lain unconscious on her examining table had become her intellectual equal and professional partner, carrying forward the tradition of integrated healing that she had pioneered while adding his own innovations and insights. "Mama Elena," Tommy said one morning as they worked together to treat a young horse with a complicated leg injury, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had made different choices that night when Dad first brought me to your clinic?" Elena paused in her work, considering the question seriously before responding. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted, "but I've come to believe that some choices are inevitable once you understand what's truly at stake. When I saw you lying there injured, I couldn't have made any decision except to try to save your leg, and once I committed to healing rather than giving up, everything else followed naturally." The horse they were treating whinnied softly and nuzzled Elena's shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that reminded her of why she had originally been drawn to working with animals. The same instinctive understanding that had made her effective with horses and cattle had eventually enabled her to bridge the gap between different human communities, proving that the principles of healing were universal even when their applications varied across cultures and species. Will joined them in the medical facility as the morning progressed, his presence still creating the sense of partnership and shared purpose that had characterized their marriage from its earliest days. Despite the passage of 25 years, the connection between them remained as strong as ever, built on the foundation of mutual respect and common commitment to building something better than what they had inherited. The territorial legislature is considering a proposal to establish medical colleges in 3 other regions, Will reported, as he helped Elena secure the bandages on the injured horse. "They want to use our model as a template for integrating traditional and modern healing practices throughout Montana." Elena felt a deep satisfaction at hearing that their work was being recognized and replicated on a broader scale. The vision that had seemed impossibly ambitious when she first agreed to marry Will was becoming reality throughout the territory, proving that sustainable change was possible when people had the courage to challenge unjust systems and work together toward common goals. The legacy that Elena and Will were creating would endure long after their own lives had ended, embedded in the institutions they had helped build and the communities they had helped transform. Their children and grandchildren would inherit a world where cooperation across cultural boundaries was normal rather than exceptional, where diversity was valued as a source of strength rather than feared as a threat to stability. As the sun climbed higher over the Montana prairie, casting its golden light across the grasslands where fortunes had once been built through division and conflict, Elena Henderson stood at the center of a community that proved love could indeed triumph over hatred, understanding could bridge the deepest cultural divides, and ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they chose healing over harm. The cattle that bore Will's brand still grazed in the pastures surrounding their home, but the name they shared represented something far more valuable than ownership or wealth. It represented the transformation of human hearts and the power of compassion to change the world one life at a time. 50 years had passed since that pivotal moment when desperation drove William Henderson to Elena Martinez's clinic, and the Montana Territory of 1935 bore little resemblance to the divided frontier settlement it had once been. Elena Henderson sat in her rocking chair on the wraparound porch of the Iron Creek ranch house, her silver hair gleaming in the late afternoon sunlight as she watched her great-grandchildren play in the yard below. At 80 years old, she remained sharp and alert, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the bustling household that had become the heart of a transformation, spanning 2 generations. The children running across the carefully tended lawn represented the fulfillment of everything Elena and Will had dreamed of creating. Little Sophia Martinez Henderson chased her cousin James Running Bear Henderson around the oak tree that Will had planted to commemorate their first wedding anniversary, while their playmate Michael Chun Henderson built elaborate castles in the sandbox that Tommy had constructed for the newest generation. These children bore surnames that told the story of Copper Valley's evolution into a truly integrated community where intermarriage across ethnic lines had become so common that few people gave it a second thought. Elena's weathered hands rested on a leather-bound journal that chronicled 5 decades of healing, innovation, and community building. She had been writing her memoirs at the encouragement of the Montana Historical Society, which wanted to preserve the story of how one woman's choice to cross cultural boundaries had reshaped an entire region. The journal contained details of thousands of patients treated, hundreds of students trained, and dozens of medical innovations that had emerged from her integration of traditional healing practices with modern scientific methods. The sound of approaching automobiles drew Elena's attention to the circular drive where a steady stream of visitors had been arriving throughout the day. Today marked the 50th anniversary of her marriage to Will, and the celebration had drawn people from across the American West who wanted to honor the couple whose partnership had proven that love could indeed conquer the prejudices that had once seemed insurmountable. Former students, political colleagues, business associates, and family friends had traveled from as far away as California and Texas to participate in the golden wedding anniversary that had become a symbol of hope for communities throughout the region. Dr. Thomas Henderson emerged from the ranch house, now a distinguished man of 62 whose graying temples and confident bearing marked him as one of the most respected medical authorities in the Mountain West. Tommy had never lost the warmth and enthusiasm that had characterized him as a child, but he had gained the wisdom and gravitas that came with decades of pioneering work in surgical medicine and medical education. His approach to healing seamlessly blended the scientific rigor he had learned in medical school with the holistic philosophy that Elena had taught him during his formative years. "Mama Elena," Tommy said, settling into the chair beside her with the easy familiarity of a son who had never lost his appreciation for the woman who had saved his life and shaped his future. "The governor will be arriving within the hour, and the university delegation should be here shortly after that. Are you ready for what's likely to be the largest gathering in Copper Valley's history?" Elena smiled at his concern, touched by the protective instinct that had characterized Tommy's relationship with her ever since he had grown old enough to understand how much she had sacrificed to ensure his recovery. "I've been ready for this celebration since the day your father first asked me to bear his name," she replied, her voice still strong despite her advanced age. "Though I must admit, I never imagined that our simple wedding would become the foundation for transforming an entire Tory." The transformation was visible in every direction Elena looked. The Iron Creek Ranch had evolved into something far more complex than a cattle operation, encompassing a medical college, an agricultural research center, a teacher training institute, and a cultural preservation program that documented and maintained the traditions of all the ethnic groups that had contributed to Copper Valley's development. The main ranch house had been expanded several times to accommodate the steady stream of visitors, students, and researchers who came to study the integration model that Elena and Will had pioneered. Beyond the ranch boundaries, the town of Copper Valley had grown into a small city of nearly 10,000 residents, whose prosperity was built on the foundation of inclusive economic development and social cooperation. The main street featured businesses owned by families representing dozens of different ethnic backgrounds, their success testament to the economic advantages of diversity and collaboration. The architectural styles reflected the cultural synthesis that characterized the community, with buildings that incorporated design elements from Mexican, Anglo, Native American, and even Asian traditions as new immigrant families had been welcomed into the growing community. The medical college that Elena had founded now attracted students from throughout North America and had gained international recognition for its innovative approaches to healing and healthcare. The curriculum continued to emphasize the integration of traditional and modern medical practices, but it had expanded to include emerging fields like psychology, public health, and medical research. Graduates of the program were known throughout the medical profession for their ability to adapt their treatments to the specific cultural and individual needs of their patients. Maria Elena Henderson Wolfe, Elena's eldest daughter, arrived with her own family as the afternoon progressed. At 45, she had inherited her mother's gift for healing and had specialized in women's health and obstetrics, developing techniques that had dramatically reduced maternal and infant mortality rates throughout the region. Her husband, a descendant of German immigrants who had been attracted to Copper Valley by its reputation for tolerance and opportunity, represented the continuing evolution of the community's demographic makeup. "Mother," Maria Elena said, embracing Elena warmly before settling into a nearby chair with her youngest daughter. Dr. Alvarez from the University of Mexico sent a telegram saying that the medical delegation from Mexico City will arrive this evening. They're particularly interested in documenting your herbal medicine techniques for a research project they're conducting on indigenous healing practices. Elena felt a deep satisfaction at hearing that her work was being recognized and studied by medical professionals in the country of her ancestors. The techniques that her grandmother had taught her as a girl, which had been dismissed as superstition by many conventional doctors, were now being validated by scientific research and integrated into medical practice throughout the Americas. The circle of knowledge that had begun with indigenous healers generations before her birth was continuing to expand and evolve, enriching medical practice for future generations. Carlos William Henderson, Elena's younger son, approached the porch with his characteristic energy and enthusiasm. At 42, he had inherited his father's business acumen and his mother's commitment to social justice, becoming a leading advocate for sustainable development and environmental conservation throughout the Mountain West. His ranch management techniques, which combined traditional Mexican grazing practices with modern scientific approaches to land stewardship, had been adopted by cattlemen from Montana to Texas. "Mama," Carlos said, his voice carrying the mixture of affection and respect that all Elena's children maintained toward her, "the delegation from the Indian Affairs Bureau is here, and they want to discuss the scholarship program you've been developing for Native American medical students. Apparently, the success rate of tribal students in our program has convinced them to fund similar initiatives throughout the country." Elena nodded with satisfaction, remembering the struggles she had faced decades earlier when she had first proposed including Native American healing traditions in the medical college curriculum. The resistance from conventional medical authorities had been intense, but the results had proven the value of her approach. Native American students brought unique perspectives and traditional knowledge that enriched the entire educational experience, while the formal medical training they received enabled them to serve their communities more effectively than ever before. The afternoon celebration continued to grow as more guests arrived from across the region and beyond. Former students who had become prominent physicians, researchers, and educators gathered to share stories of how Elena's teaching had influenced their careers and shaped their approach to healing. Political leaders who had implemented integration policies based on the Copper Valley model came to pay their respects to the woman, whose vision had proven that inclusive communities were stronger and more prosperous than divided ones. Governor Samuel Rodriguez, himself a graduate of the Henderson Medical College, and a testament to the opportunities that Elena's work had created for Mexican-American professionals, delivered a speech that captured the significance of the Golden Anniversary celebration. Elena Henderson represents the best of what America can become when we choose cooperation over conflict, understanding over prejudice, and healing over hatred, he said to the assembled crowd. Her life's work has proven that our diversity is not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be celebrated and utilized for the benefit of all. As evening approached and the formal celebration moved to the beautifully decorated barn that had been converted into a reception hall, Elena found herself surrounded by representatives of all the communities that had been touched by her half-century of service. Mexican-American families whose children had gained access to higher education through the programs she had established sat alongside Anglo-ranchers whose operations had been improved by the sustainable practices she had promoted. Native American tribal leaders whose traditional knowledge had been preserved and honored through her cultural documentation. Projects shared tables with recent immigrants from Europe and Asia who had found welcome and opportunity in the inclusive community she had helped create. The evening's entertainment reflected the cultural richness that had emerged from decades of integration and cooperation. Traditional Mexican mariachi music alternated with Anglo folk songs and Native American ceremonial dances, creating a celebration that honored all the traditions that had contributed to Copper Valley's unique character. Young people who had grown up taking diversity for granted performed alongside elderly community members who remembered the tense divisions that had once seemed permanent and insurmountable. Will Henderson, now 85, but still possessing the commanding presence that had made him a natural leader, rose to address the gathering as the evening reached its peak. His voice, though softer than it had been in his younger years, still carried the authority and warmth that had enabled him to build bridges across the deepest cultural divides. 50 years ago, Will began, his eyes finding Elena's across the crowded room. I made what I thought was a desperate proposal to a woman I barely knew, asking her to marry me so that she could continue caring for my injured son. I thought I was simply trying to solve a practical problem, but Elena taught me that the best solutions often come from opening our hearts to possibilities we never imagined existed. The applause that greeted his words was warm and sustained, reflecting the genuine affection that the community felt for the couple, whose love story had become the foundation for their shared prosperity. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes as she remembered that terrifying night when she had faced the choice between safety and service, between maintaining comfortable boundaries and risking everything for the possibility of healing. What Elena gave me wasn't just a wife and a mother for Tommy, Will continued, but a completely new way of understanding what it means to build a community. She showed me that when we include everyone in the process of solving problems, we get solutions that work for everyone. When we value the contributions that all people can make, regardless of their background or the color of their skin, we create something stronger and more beautiful than anything we could achieve alone. As the celebration continued late into the night, Elena found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from a lonely veterinarian working in a converted barn to the matriarch of a community that had become a model for integration and cooperation throughout the American West. The path had not always been easy, and there had been moments when the obstacles seemed insurmountable and the resistance to change felt overwhelming. But the results were undeniable, visible in the faces of the children who played together without regard to ethnic boundaries, in the success of the businesses that thrived through cooperative effort, and in the prosperity that had emerged from inclusive development. The medical innovations that had begun with her treatment of Tommy's injuries had evolved into a comprehensive approach to healthcare that was being studied and replicated throughout the world. The integration of traditional and modern healing practices that she had pioneered had become the foundation for a new understanding of medicine that emphasized the connection between physical, emotional, and spiritual wellness. Her students, now practicing throughout the Americas, carried forward the philosophy that healing was about more than treating symptoms, but about understanding and addressing the root causes of suffering. The educational system that had emerged From her initial efforts to teach Tommy and other children about different cultural traditions had become a model for inclusive education that prepared students for success in an increasingly interconnected world. The curriculum that emphasized practical skills alongside academic subjects, that valued diverse perspectives and approaches to problem solving, had produced graduates who were sought after by employers and universities throughout the country. The economic development that had resulted from the integration policies she and Will had promoted had created prosperity that extended far beyond Copper Valley. The sustainable ranching practices that had been developed through collaboration between different cultural traditions had improved environmental outcomes while increasing productivity. The businesses that had been established through partnerships between different ethnic communities had created innovation and competitive advantages that benefited everyone involved. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Elena found herself alone with Will on the porch where they had shared so many conversations over the decades. The sounds of cleanup and farewells drifted from the barn, but the immediate space around them was peaceful and quiet. The stars that had witnessed their first tentative steps toward understanding each other still shone overhead, unchanged despite all the transformation that had occurred below. "Do you think we've accomplished what we set out to do?" Will asked, taking Elena's hand in his with the same tenderness he had shown throughout their 50 years of marriage. Elena considered the question carefully, thinking about the goals they had articulated in those early days when their vision for integration and cooperation had seemed impossibly ambitious. "We've accomplished more than I ever dared to dream," she replied finally. "But perhaps more importantly, we've created a foundation that will enable future generations to build something even better than what we've achieved." The legacy that Elena and Will were leaving was embedded not just in the institutions they had established, but in the hearts and minds of the people whose lives they had touched. Their children and grandchildren had inherited not just material prosperity, but a philosophy of life that emphasized service, cooperation, and the belief that every person had unique gifts to contribute to the common good. The community they had helped build would continue to evolve and grow, adapting to new challenges and opportunities while maintaining the core values of inclusion and mutual respect that had made their success possible. As Elena prepared for bed that night, she paused to look out the window at the land that had become her home and the setting for the most important work of her life. The moonlight illuminated the pastures where cattle bearing Will's brand grazed peacefully, but her thoughts were focused on the invisible bonds of understanding and cooperation that connected all the people who called Copper Valley home. Name she bore represented more than marriage or social position. It represented the choice to build bridges rather than walls, to seek healing rather than harbor resentment, and to believe that love could indeed triumph over the forces that sought to divide people from one another. The young woman who had once stood in a converted barn clinic, faced with the choice between helping a dying child and protecting herself from social consequences, could never have imagined that her decision would create ripples that would transform an entire region. But Elena understood now that the most important choices were often the ones that seemed impossibly difficult at the time. The moments when ordinary people found the courage to do extraordinary things because they believed that healing and understanding were worth any personal cost. The cattle would always bear Will's brand, marking them as his property according to the customs of the range. But the name that Elena bore, the name she had given to her children and that they would pass on to future generations, represented something far more valuable than ownership or wealth. It represented the transformation of human hearts, the power of love to overcome prejudice, and the eternal truth that when people choose cooperation over conflict, understanding over fear, and healing over hatred, they create miracles that endure long after their own lives have ended. The dawn that broke over Copper Valley on the morning after the golden anniversary celebration illuminated a community that stood as living proof that the American dream of equality and opportunity for all was not just an idealistic vision but an achievable reality for those with the courage to pursue it. Elena Henderson had become more than a pioneer in medicine or a successful rancher's wife. She had become a symbol of hope for anyone who believed that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable and instead chose to build the more perfect union that America's founders had envisioned, but never fully achieved. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.